Hello, people. Welcome to Aha Moments with Don Onyi. In the little number of years I've lived on earth, I've encountered people who say that culture is evil. I've also come across people who are of the opinion that culture and everything about it is absolutely phenomenal. Yet, a third school of thoughts with respect to culture are of the opinion that culture is sacrosanct. They believe that culture was, culture is, and will continue to be, and any attempt to change it is absolutely unacceptable. Now, what is culture? Culture is those material and non-material traits of a particular group. This group could be a racial group, it could be a religious group, or a social group. So culture includes everything about their lifestyle, their behaviors, their practices, values, norms, even belief system, language, material and non-material traits generally about a people. So now, do we say that culture is evil? Like I said, some people believe that culture is evil and wouldn't want to have anything to do with culture. But truth be told, culture is not evil. Because culture defines who people are. Activities like funeral rites are not evil in themselves. Marriage, people's fashion, their cuisine, their music, art, which are all aspects of their culture, cannot be said to be evil in itself. However, there are aspects of culture that are evil. There are elements of culture that is evil. A good example is the mutilation of genitals of girls in the name of culture. In Africa, there are some communities, there are some African societies that still engage in female genital mutilation just because they believe it's their culture. This is an evil practice, in all sense, because it doesn't have any positive consequence for the girl child. Things like burying chiefs or traditional rulers or some prominent people in the society with living people, with the argument that these are prominent people, and even in the world of the dead, they need servants, and then they bury them with human, living people. This is absolutely evil. Things like killing of twins that used to be the practice in Africa in times past. These are aspects or elements of culture that are evil, but culture itself is not necessarily evil. Culture is good. It defines a people. It defines who they are. It gives them a sense of group identity. And many aspects of culture are actually very, very good. Now, what makes a culture good or evil? Actually, what makes a culture good or evil is the effects of that cultural practices on the people that practice it. So any cultural practice that has negative effects or consequences is not right. For instance, I already mentioned female genital mutilation. For people that practice this dastardly act, they tell you that the reason for it is so that the girl child will not be promiscuous. Forgetting that there are a lot of medical complications and other negative effects and consequences of this act. So the consequence of an action, a cultural practice, makes it right or wrong. These are the things that make culture good or bad. Now, the question is, what makes culture dynamic? Actually, cultures change sometimes spontaneously and they are not even noticed. These things are not planned. There are no obvious forces behind such change. But at other times, things like globalization, where there's a lot of cultural contacts and a lot of trade of cultural traits and practices. You see, the fact that we connect to the rest of the world from anywhere you are through the Internet of Things, you are able to learn a few things, speak a few things from different cultures, and those other cultures, you also trade some aspects of your own culture. So globalization leads to culture change. There are also some cultures that change as a result of people's efforts, deliberate efforts to change such cultures. A good example is in a particular community that I know, their daughters were not getting married as they should. And when they made inquiries, they found out that the requirements for the bride price was so much, and that was scaring the men away. And the elders of the community stood up one morning and said, let us review this. Even though they met stiff opposition, but at the end of the day, they were able to review it, cut down on a lot of things. And then their daughter started getting married. Because the prize was actually chasing the men away. So a lot of things, actually, there are a lot of forces that can lead to change of culture. Some are spontaneous, some are deliberate efforts, maybe globalization, like I've also said, and many other reasons why culture keeps changing. For an individual to initiate culture change, it's actually a very difficult thing because there are people who stand their ground, people who are obstinate, that they are very recalcitrant and they wouldn't have culture change. So the individual needs to put on a lot of pressure, maybe sell their idea to other people, members of that cultural group, and then they put up a pressure to campaign or sensitize the people about the ills of that particular cultural practice. I think this is what women in Africa are doing in contemporary times, even though they are gaining some grounds, but there's a lot more to do. But women have come to know that, well, the system is not nice, it's not favorable to us. And then they are beginning to gather themselves together to ask for their rights, to ask for inclusion, to ask that every gender barrier be broken, gender bias now be broken, and that they be included in the scheme of things. So initiating culture change by an individual or even a group of people is not easy, but it's something that with continuous pressure, they can begin to make headway, just like women in Africa are beginning to make headway, even though it's a very slow one at the moment. It's easier to change culture as an insider because you are a participant observer. You understand it perfectly and you know how exactly or what exactly the issues with a particular cultural practice is and how to go about campaigning against that particular or clamoring against that particular practice. This is totally different from an observer, an outside observer who is not a participant. Sometimes they tend to say things from their own perspective because they truly, truly do not understand. And I think that's the problem we had initially in feminism, when middle class white women tried to make a case for African women. As a matter of fact, they generalized that all women's experiences are the same. So everyone should join hands together to fight, gender bias. And then the African women rose up and said, our experiences are not the same. You are an observer of our experiences, but you don't participate in what you're observing. And you may not understand the difference. We are the ones participating and observing at the same time, and we know how exactly to change it. And that was why the radical feminists, the white radical feminists, were not able to sell their feminism to African women, even though some African women subscribe to radical feminism and all of that, but A good number of African women said, no, our experiences are different. We are not separatists here. We do not see men as people we do not need. We need them. We believe in complementarity. And that was how the whole idea of African feminism came up, because we refused to accept, being in the same class or having exactly the same experience, or allowing even the white women define our own experience. So it's difficult actually to bring about a change in culture as an outsider. But as an insider who is experiencing that particular culture, you don't just have information, but you are experiencing it. It's different from just reading things, from books on the media, and then coming up with ideas on how to go about culture change. The insider outsider principle or dichotomy with respect to understanding culture and initiating change in culture applies to every kind of culture, but now it can cut across religious culture, it can cut across social culture. Little wonder it's difficult for people who are not Gen Zs, who do not belong to Generation Z, to really understand their culture in contemporary times. And it's difficult to affect change in their lives. As a lecturer in the university, I keep telling my colleagues who care to listen that if we continue to teach the students the way we're taught, we're going to be boring them, because society has moved past that level of speaking to students in class, trying to show them things from books. This generation are interested in seeing content, they're interested in seeing videos, they're interested in hands-on, they're interested in what technology can do for them in their courses, and they're interested in just using technology to learn their course. So it's difficult for a non-Gen Z, a millennial, for instance, to bring about change in the culture of the Gen Z. So it still boils down to the fact that you have to be a participant in a particular culture to understand that culture, or at least be an immigrant. For instance, I'm not a Gen Z, but I'm an immigrant. I have migrated from my generation because I want to be a participant observer of what the Gen Zs feel, how they come up with their ideas, and how they go about their culture. So you need to be part and parcel of them to be able to understand them and to be able to manage their culture effectively. Okay, like I was saying, cultures evolve. Sometimes aspects of culture fizzle out, and then new cultures are born. And this is not even to say that the new culture that is born do not have any negative effects or consequences, or do not have bad elements, like we said, that cultural practices could have bad or evil elements. So even the new cultures could have their own downturns in terms of, characteristics. But then these cultures are there, and then people begin to tinker with it, begin to have a better understanding of it and go about it. And then you see people also proposing change in some aspects of culture. A good example is the addiction to devices by young people, in contemporary times. You see even old people too. Let me not just say it's only Gen Zs. See older people being addicted to devices where they cannot do a minute without looking at their phones. When you have a group of people sitting together and not a word from one person to the other, but they are busy, focused on their phones, chatting with people all over the world, and this has actually led to some social issues. And of course, it's now a problem of a new culture. So every culture comes with its own bad elements, good elements, and all of that. But culture continues to evolve. That's the bottom line. Continues to change. Knowing that culture has both positive and negative effects, the question is culture really dynamic, or is it sacrosanct? And looking at all that we have said, you find out that culture is actually dynamic. Culture keeps changing. However, this school of thought that believe that culture is sacrosanct, insists that culture shouldn't change. And any change in culture alters who the people are. But this has not been the reality because we've seen that even people's languages are altered, people's cuisines is altered, people's dress sense, fashion is altered. So a lot about culture has been altered over the years. So I'm beginning to think that those who insist on the sacrosanctity of culture are playing the game of convenience. Perhaps they are benefiting from the aspects of culture that they insist are sacrosanct. And most times when they benefit is at the detriment of a certain demography of their culture. Cultures evolve, cultures change. That's the dynamism of culture. I think the time has come to jettison the idea of the sacrosanctity of culture. Aha! I remain your host, Dr. Inyechi Wariboko. Thank you for listening and see you next week at Aha Moments with Don Onyin. Bye for now.